Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 607. Today we're going to look at Flamme Rouge. Now this came out last year from Pays. It's now being brought over to the US, at least by Stronghold Games. This is a bike racing game, so each player is going to control a team of two bicyclists, and you're going to be racing around this track that you can kind of just build how you want. There's some cards that will suggest different tracks. There'll be hills up and down, all this kind of stuff. It has an interesting kind of deck building aspect to it, but it's not really deck building, but we'll look at that in the mechanics, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think. Okay, here's just about everything that you get in the game. You can see I've kind of built this little makeshift track. This is much smaller than you're going to use when you play. You can see I've got a lot of leftover pieces here, lots of curves and straight angles. Typically what you'll do is you'll shuffle up these cards here, and it gives you a track that you can choose to start off with. This one here, Avenue Corsa Paseo, and it just tells you how you can build it. There's little letters. Sometimes they'll be larger black capital letters. These will typically have hills on them. So if we take a look at here, you can see this has kind of an uphill in the red and then a downhill in the blue. And I would say for your first game, probably don't play with the hills. You probably could if you really wanted to, but I think it's nice to kind of get how the race is going to time itself out before you add in the kind of the extra little tiny layer of complexity with the hills. And then players will take turns setting up their two bikes here. You can see that you've got two kinds of riders here. So this fella here, he's sort of bent over, hunched over. He is the rondelleur. How do you spell it? Rouleur, sorry. So you can see he's got an R on the back of his shirt there. And then we have the sprinter here, and this has, whoop, it's not really focusing, but you can see he's kind of standing up straight, and then it's got an S there on the back. So each rider has kind of a sprint rider and then more of an endurance kind of long-term rider. And you can see here for the blue player, we have two different decks. We have the sprinter deck here marked with an S, and you can see the blue cards all have the blue numbers. And then we have the endurance rider here marked with an R and then all numbers in their color. Now each player is going to get a player aid, and they're double-sided here, and this tells you kind of the breakdown of the deck. So sprinter here has got 3 of the 2 speed all the way down to 3 of the 9 speed. Now you can see you can jump from 5 to 9, whereas the endurance guy's got 6s and 7s and stuff. So there's a little bit more swingy here, but they don't have 2s. And so this one is a little bit more even keel. And so you're going to be racing both of them. You just need to get one across the finish line. And then of course this also tells you the different phases of the games. So how does it work? So each player is going to pick a deck of their choice. And so let's say I'm going to choose sprinter. You're going to draw 4 cards off the top, and then you're going to choose one to put out. So I've got my 3 9s here. I just shuffled these, so probably don't want to use these until later in the race. Just give you a little tip. So maybe I'll choose the 5, and then we'll put that face down and then reveal it. Everybody will reveal, and then these are called what's cycled back in. They're put in face up, and so as you draw through over the turns, once you get the face up ones, you'll shuffle them back up and then draw back up to 4 for that turn. So each player will do 2 riders. So we'll do this one, and then everybody else will do the other rider, and then we're going to do this one here. And so we'll draw 4 of the endurance guy. And so, oh, these are really high too. So maybe I'll be a little bit different, and then I'll play the 7 here and do like that. And then you're going to then move the bicyclists in order of who's ever in front. So right now the black and the green are in front, but the right-hand lane, you can see these are like little squares here with the lanes. So whoever's in front and the right hand will go first, and then maybe they chose 3, so they go 1, 2, 3. And when you move up, you can move in and through other riders. You always, if you can, you're going to try to end your turn in the rightmost. So let's say this black rider here, if they went up and they're in the same spot, then they would end up in the left. Whereas if they went one more spot, they would push themselves over to the rightmost spot. And then everybody's going to go, and I'm just going to ignore the hills for now, and let's just put everybody in a random kind of setup here. And we'll do like this. And this is not quite realistic, but we'll put this guy way out here just because, let's pretend, right? Okay, so then after everybody's moved, then you're going to look and see if you are able to apply slipstreaming, and that's basically drafting. So you're going to work your way back, and you're going to look at all the groups of riders. So here's one group because they're all touching. Here's another group with these 3 because they're all touching this way, and another group, and then finally the sole rider up here is his own group. If there is only one square, one spot in front of them, they're going to slowly catch up and get a free movement out of that. Now this will have formed now a larger pack, And if there was one movement, or excuse me, one space in between these, then these would then again move up, but they're not. They're not within one space of this. So they're going to be stuck here. And then let's say I moved him a little bit further than I wanted to. And so let's say these guys come up here, there's only one space, they're going to move up like so. And so that's going to end the turn. The riders that are in the front of each of the packs after you've resolved all of that is going to get an exhaustion card. So you can see this one here is an S as a sprinter, and this fella here is the R. So the green player will take one of the cards out of the R stack. You can see these don't have a color, but they have the same backs. And so this is a very bad card. It's a movement of 2. And so if you are ending up being in the front of the packs in a race, you're going to collect more of these, and you don't really want to draw a bunch of 2s, especially at the end of the race. And then the red player in this case, because they have the person in the frontmost pack, they'll take a 2 out of the S because they have the S on the back there. So they'll shuffle those into the deck. They'll actually put them at the bottom face up, just like you would at the start of the turn. And if for some reason there was 2 riders at the front of the pack like this, then both of them would get that exhaustion card. And then you do the same thing. We're going to draw again 4 cards. You're going to choose one, and maybe we'll choose the 4 this time. And we'll put that down here. And then that's it. You keep going until somebody gets across the finish line. If multiple people cross the finish line at the same time, whoever crosses it the furthest will get it. And again, the rightmost column here is going to be in the lead as opposed to the leftmost column there. And if you get to the very, very end spot, that's really going to lock in your victory because you can't go past the end of that board. Now, if we take a look here, I talked a little bit about the elevation. This is sort of like an advanced rule. You can see here we have the downhill slope. You can see this is pushing against the resistance. I'm not sure if you can see those little arrows. Yeah, there you can. So anyway, this is always going to be going against the riders. And then you have sort of the opposite of that, the downhill. And this is going to be giving the riders a little bit of an extra boost. And there's always these little iconography symbols here and here that are going to remind you what they do. So what happens is if you start your turn in the red or enter it or go through it at all, you are capped at a speed 5. So even if I had played, let's say one of these 9s down here that I had earlier, is if I interact at all with this uphill slope here, it cuts it off and my maximum speed is 5. You'll also notice this symbol here that you can't slipstream or draft the group that maybe is one space in front of you if it's on a hill like that. And that includes if you're in the front and somebody was behind you like so, then these guys cannot give nor receive slipstreaming is what the rules actually say there. So there's no slipstreaming involved. Now the opposite of that is the blue here, and this is the downstream. Now this only applies if you start your turn on a blue space. No matter what card you play, it's going to be at least a 5. So this is just a little bit of a wrinkle on the basic gameplay that you have to keep in mind. You can have a whole bunch of up and down hills, or just maybe one spot, maybe one right towards the end or one right at the beginning, and that kind of stuff. You can kind of play around a little bit with that. But that's really all of the rules to the game. Okay, so that is Flamme Rouge, and I really have enjoyed this game. Now, like I said in the walkthrough, I think you want to play the basic game without any of the hills or slopes, because you really kind of have to see, at least I did, kind of see the race evolve over time. Because there's something to be said for holding your high numbered cards back and applying those late in the game to sort of, blow through that finish line. And there's a real interesting kind of tension as you kind of build up the race. You're trying to just kind of keep up with the pack, and you don't really want to acquire any of those exhaustion cards because that's going to hinder you if you draw a whole hand of those at the end of the race. So you're kind of balancing between that, and then when do you kind of trigger and use your sprinter, let's say, to bust out and get ahead of everybody. And the one interesting thing about the game is it allows you to look at the cards you've played, because I just realized I didn't mention this during the walkthrough. If you play a card, or when you play a card, you can no longer use that card again. It effectively is discard out of your deck. But you can always look through the cards that you've played, and then also look through the cards that you've chosen not to play so far. So if we look at the deck here, you can see, you can peek back here and say, okay, my 9s are all down there. I know I don't have a 9 coming. Now you can't look at what's in your deck that you haven't seen yet, but that gives you interesting kind of decisions to say, okay, let me wait, and I know I'm going to get my 9 next turn, that kind of thing. So that's really cool. And there's not really like so much going on that it becomes a burden to kind of count those cards. It's really very much part of the game. And then once you add in the slopes and the up and downhill, that gets even more interesting, because you might try to be very conservative with what you play in terms of, you're like, okay, I'm gonna hit the downhill, so I can play this too, and I'm gonna shoot ahead, and that just kind of adds in that little kind of fuzzy extra layer of calculation in terms of like, what cards am I trying to play over the long haul, over the course of the game. Now the game actually does play just fine with 2 players. It's very, very interesting because you've got both riders that you're kind of ticking and tacking with, and so you can kind of, if you get one kind of lost behind, you can eventually catch up with it while your other one kind of maintains with the front of the pack. But it is more interesting for sure when you add the 3rd and the 4th player, just because you get the different groups and you try to like kind of get sucked up into the leader pack as you sort of bounce your way up. It feels like more of a cinematic style of race, because you have kind of a little bit more opportunity, I think, for some of these come behind victories, and you feel like you're being a little bit more tactical with your racing and stuff like that. So I definitely recommend the game. Now the interesting thing about this is, as soon as I was done playing it the last time, I was like, I think I heard there was an expansion for this. I'm like, I wonder what would come in here, because it is pretty basic and simple in terms of like, all the complexity of the mechanics. There's not really very much complexity at all. Now there is an expansion coming, I believe this year at Essen. It's going to add enough cards to play, I think, up to 8 players if you really want to, and even up to 16 if each player just controls a single rider, if you wanted to do that. So that is kind of cool, and I think it's going to add some other things as well. So I think that's a really interesting way, because I could see this getting a lot of play, and it kind of feels a little bit like a party game. There's like just enough going on that it keeps you kind of interested in that gamer side of it. But then there's just a lot of interesting kind of fun moments that happen as like people get left behind, or somebody makes a bolt for it and then they get passed by everybody else and end up in like almost basically last place, because it's just like you watch on the Olympics or something, on a marathon or a long bike race, that person, they just sprint too early and they just run out of gas, and they didn't really plan their deck right, or they get a kind of a lame hand of cards there right at the end and they're just passed by. So it's really kind of cinematic moments. So I definitely recommend this game. It's one of those rare games that you could kind of play with the family, with the gamer group, that kind of idea. So I think I'd highly recommend this one. Thanks.